my pleasure to welcome you all to, this is the second of the year of our Urban Institute seminar series. We're really privileged today to have Mark Rothstein with us. Let me just do a very quick introduction. And while I'm getting my papers ready, let me say one more thing, and so I'll say it at the end as well. Next seminar is October 10. In this room again, it will be Glenn Cohen from Harvard Law School. We have only lawyers, I guess, in succession. He'll be talking about medical tourism, so make sure that's on your calendar. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker today, is Mark Rothstein. As you see from the slide behind me, Mark is a JD, so a law professor. He is the Herman F. Bowl Chair in Law and Medicine and Director of the Institute for Bioethics, Health Policy, and Law at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. His work over a pretty long time, I guess I would say many years, that seems fair.
Many years.
Many years, to the tune of 250 articles and the author or editor of 19 books, focused mostly on health privacy, bioethics, genetics, and public health. He is the past president of the American Society for Law, Medicine, and Ethics, which produces an important journal in our field called the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. An elected member of the American Law Institute, which is sort of like the NAS for those of you who aren't familiar with law, and an elected fellow of the Hastings Center. I've known him for a very long time. He's a good friend and colleague, and it's really a privilege to welcome you back to Hopkins. Mark's talk today will be entitled, as you see on the slide behind me, Ethical Challenges of Unregulated Health Research Using Mobile Devices. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rothstein.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was originally scheduled to visit in January, and the big snowstorm kept me back in Louisville, so I have to say the weather is much better today than my last scheduled visit. Today I'm going to be talking about something that's an emerging issue, and as I tell my students, I don't have the answers. On a good day I have the right questions, and I hope I can raise some issues for you that will stimulate your thinking about a new avenue of research that is really taking off. So I'm sure there are many of you who have wearable devices. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands without any sort of prior consent from you. And I'm sure many of you also have downloaded health apps on your smartphones or tablets or something. They're becoming increasingly common. There are 90,000 of them available on iTunes and 75,000 about on the Android App Store. As you can see on the slide, most of them are for fitness and wellness, 25% for disease management. 90% of them are free, and the most interesting figure on the slide, I think, is that 33% of physicians, quote, prescribe health apps, which I gather means using some sort of health app to control or keep a list of your symptoms for people with chronic diseases so that you can report to your physician how you're doing. Medical devices and apps are going far beyond the simple Fitbit model. With external add-ons, you can now turn a smartphone into a device that will measure your substitute for an EKG, for an ultrasound machine, and all sorts of lab devices. And from there, you can imagine if you've got millions of people out there with these devices, how they might be used for health research. This slide puts into a figure how they might be broken down by two characteristics. One, whether the research is covered by the common rule, Or another way of putting it, whether the researchers who are doing the research are covered by the common rule. And here, whether the data is gathered for research or it was gathered for some other purpose. I'm not going to be so concerned today in my talk with those for research covered by the common rule. I'm sure at Hopkins and many other institutions there are dozens of studies that went through the IRB that were closely analyzed that involve the use of M health because it's increasingly common. I'm going to be talking about what's in green today. These three areas and then this fourth area. Research that is not subject to the common rule where the data were gathered for a research purpose. There are three that I identify here: citizen science, patient-directed research, and independent research. These are really related, and I think it would be very difficult to say they're discrete categories. They kind of blend into each other, and I'm going to talk about each of those. And then there's this category of data that are supplied to or scooped up by app developers and health companies or others where it was not done for research, but now they've got their hands on something that can be turned into research and that can be turned into cash. So what are the concerns that permeate this area? Well, one is that physical harms can be caused by erroneous health information. There have been several studies of these health apps, and in some of them, they indicate that half or more of the information that's conveyed, for example, on a cancer app, is not correct, or at least is not justified by clinical data. So we don't want people getting misinformation through using these apps. Second, you have the possibility of dignitary and psychological harms if there are erroneous assessments of the risk from health, and people will worry when they don't have to be worried, or the opposite, they will not see seek regular medical care for checkups and so forth. Third, you have the economic harms caused by medical identity theft. And fourth, if we rely on this information and it's flawed, then there can be very serious health harms across the country. So of the first of these three in the upper box I want to talk about is the concept of citizen science. Well, historically, citizen science was the way that all science, more or less, was conducted before we had a regular corps of professional scientists. And I want to go back only to the 18th century to start my trip forward. And Benjamin Franklin, of course, picked it on this famous Currier and Ives rendering with his son William doing his electricity experiments. One of the interesting things about Franklin is he dropped out of school at age 10. So everything that he did was self-taught. He's the sort of a consummate citizen scientist. For my 19th century selection, I went with Gregor Mendel, and I know many of you who work in genetics. Mendel, of course, was born to a farm family with very little money. His birth name was Johann. He took the name Gregor when he became an Augustinian monk in Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. And as you all know, he did all these wonderful experiments with peas. He didn't actually start out with peas. Many people don't realize this. He started his research with rodents. And the abbot came to him one day and said, you got to give those rodents away. There are two reasons for that. Number one, they stink. And number two, a man of the cloth shouldn't be engaged in breeding these animals all the time. So he went to peas. And Mendel actually wrote a letter to his sister and said, if the abbot knew that peas reproduce sexually, I'd have nothing to do. At any rate, he published one paper in his entire lifetime, and that paper is still the basis for for modern genetics. My 20th century pick is not a citizen scientist. He reflects the professionalism of science. And Einstein, of course, studied math and physics at the University of Zurich. And when he emigrated to the United States, he was associated with Princeton University for the rest of his career. Well, now we get up to the 21st century, and where does the new citizen science come from? Originally, it came from scientists recruiting citizens to help them and be their assistants in counting wildlife and doing things in support of established scientific research. Then it became apparent that citizens could be recruited to do more things and that they wanted to do more things. So they would get together and use their combined computer power in a sort of crowdsourcing way to analyze data from the Kepler. They would get together and form do-it-yourself sort of hacker scientist laboratories which exist across the country where people can show up and do their own scientific research. They may have credentials outside of science. They may be computer scientists. They may have some advanced degree in something that's not biologically oriented, but they see scientific research and scientific data as just another form of data. And if you're a computer wizard and you have imagination, they think, in many instances, that they can contribute to research. The second category consists of patient-directed and patient-enabled research. And there are three examples on the slide. One is the Genetic Alliance, which started out as sort of an umbrella organization for a variety of genetic disease, essentially support groups. But increasingly, they moved into research by enabling, by recruiting or facilitating the link between researchers and possible research participants. Patients like me is that started out the way the Genetic Alliance actually has moved toward, in other words, supporting research. But in some instances, patients like me is actually engaged in research. So about 5 years ago, there were reports of anecdotal and small studies that suggested that treatment with lithium delayed the onset of symptoms for ALS. About 150 patients like me, members with ALS, decided to look into that. And they ran their own patients like me clinical trial. They obtained prescriptions for lithium off-label. They took lithium as prescribed. They compared their progress or lack of progress according to standard criteria and published a paper in which they definitively showed that it was a null finding. They rebutted the suspicion that lithium might be effective. And here you have a group of patients actually doing a clinical study. The Personal Genome Project is an open access repository for genotype information based on whole genome sequencing plus medical records that are available to anyone on the internet. The third area is the one that made the most noise, if you will, and which has demonstrated most clearly the value of mobile health research, and that is independent research. In the spring of 2015, Sage Bionetworks, which is an independent research organization based in Seattle, used the newly released Apple Research Kit and their own software, teaming up with some private foundations, such as the Michael J. Fox Foundation and some Parkinson's researchers, to start what was called the Empower study. It used microphone, accelerometer, touchscreen, and other sensors already on the iPhone. So the Parkinson's patients were directed by the study to, for example, holding your iPhone in front of you, take 3 steps forward, and then take 3 steps back. And when the touch screen lit certain numbers or symbols, the patient was supposed to touch them as they appeared. And then these sensors were recorded over time and compared with other symptoms and medical information. Interestingly, the Empower study used an online consent toolkit. The individuals had to consent, they had to pass a quiz, they had to, as you see, sign with their finger on the line below. For us, thinking about the ethical issues, it's interesting that the study was approved by Western IRB. The reason I say that is it need not have been approved. This was not research that was federally funded, done by a federally funding institution. It was not done in contemplation of a submission to the FDA, etc. It was not covered by the federal research regs. Yet they wanted it, have it approved by the IRB. And notably, 17,000 participants enrolled in 6 months, making it by far the largest Parkinson's study ever done. And you can imagine the potential for using these techniques with other conditions. Here are 2 that are going on right now. On the left is a research project called Mole Mapper that SAGE is doing with Oregon Health and Sciences University. And basically what they're trying to do is test the feasibility and the accuracy of a smartphone-based program that would take a picture of somebody's mole, day 1 and day 2 and day 30, and develop an algorithm for trying to establish whether it was benign or malignant and compare it to clinical observations. On the right is something that's being done by Duke, involving autism. If you can't see in the back, it says, while your child watches a video on your iPhone, we will record your child's face to measure emotion. You can have the left version where they see the child's face, and if you don't put your child's face shown, it will appear as this, because they want to see the affect in the child who's seeing these different videos. Here are the research data collection possibilities that you see in the sensors, accelerometer, gyroscope, etc. These are features already built into the iPhone. And you can imagine all the external add-ons that could be used in research. Now, the 4th category, the one below the line in my earlier slide, is where information was developed not for research, but then perhaps it's monetized or used in some way for research. This is a study that appeared earlier this year in JAMA, and what the authors did there was they analyzed the diabetes apps available in Android form, and to try to check out what the privacy policies were of these various health apps. Many of them didn't have privacy policies at all, but the ones that did have privacy policies, by downloading the app, you are consenting to have the app take pictures and videos without your consent, and to access all your accounts on the device, to use GPS location to directly call cell phone numbers that are in your, I mean, it's unbelievable. And people are just saying, oh, I want this neat health app, and they just click on this, and the fine print gives them the right to invade your electronic life. That is, I've given this study that was published earlier this year by the MIT Technology Review. Percentage of people saying they share their health history with their physician, interestingly, inside the 90%. Family drops off a lot, and all the way at the bottom is technology. People don't want to share their information with technology companies, but they are consenting all the time by clicking the terms and conditions for the download. Okay, so I've set the table on one side, at least I hope, and that is talking about the technology. Second, I'm going to go through very briefly the major provisions regulating research, and then I'm going to try to put the two together and raise the very interesting questions. So as most, if not all of you know, research is regulated in the United States through the Common Rule. We are possibly going to have a major upheaval of the Common Rule. In September of last year, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking would change the Common Rule in many ways, two of which is that coverage, instead of depending on identifiability, will depend on whether it's biospecimens or health information, and the source of the information, whether it was obtained for research or obtained for another purpose. That might have bearing on what I'm talking about today, because we're talking about, in some cases, research that was obtained for another purpose. Second is the FDA, which has its own research regs, and they've also begun regulating what they call medical applications. This would not be the Fitbit, it would be the fancy add-on that would allow you to do ultrasounds or EKGs. Another agency is the Federal Trade Commission, which prohibits deceptive trade practices, and that might be implicated. The FTC, as you can see, has issued a joint interactive tool with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at HHS and the Office for Civil Rights at HHS, indicating some guidance for what regs are or are not applicable to mobile health apps. Then, of course, there's everyone's favorite, the Hipaa privacy rule, which applies to health providers, health plans, clearinghouses, and after 2013, their business associates. The medical app developers who develop all these new apps are not covered entities, as you can see. And there are 5 states that have their own research. There are 4 states that have their own research laws, including Maryland. And generally what these laws say is that any research done in this jurisdiction, regardless of whether it's covered by the Common Rule, still has to comply with the requirements of the Common Rule, although there's very little enforcement and litigation under state research laws. Okay, so we've got the devices, we've got the laws and the ethics, and now to try to put them together. What are the ethical considerations? And I've identified 8 key issues. And the first one is, should there be external review? Should an IRB be involved to approve the research? Now, by definition, there is no IRB required because this is unregulated research. And the first question is, would unregulated researchers want an IRB to be involved? If you think of the mindset of the hacker scientist, I think the answer is probably not. And do citizen scientists even know about the existence of IRBs just based on anecdotal reports? The answer to that is clearly not. So then the question is, are there other models of independent research review that might be appealing to this group? If we could distill the benefits of the IRB external review without the perceived burden. Is there some way that we can identify things to make a recommendation? Okay, you don't have to do all these things, but here are 3 things that we think are important. And the second is, what credentials should we have for researchers? This is my homage to the late Gene Wilder. What credentials should you need to get access? Sage Bionetworks said, we're not going to give our health information to anyone who's not a qualified researcher, and these are the conditions. They must pass an 18-question ethics exam. They must be affiliated with an academic center and or have a professional license. They must make a public statement of intended data use, which would subject them to the FTC enforcement for deceptive trade practices if they didn't follow it. And they must execute a data sharing contract, which says something like, we will not redistribute this without the permission of Sage, we will not sell the information, we will not attempt to identify people who are de-identified. Number 3, what about recruitment and inducements to participate? Is a therapeutic misconception a concern in smartphone-based research? Probably not. How can you envision something that you're doing on your phone curing you? On the other hand, people may be misled about the imminence of research gains. If I participate, a year from now, they're going to have a cure for Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. Is recruitment by fellow patients inherently coercive? If you get an email, let's assume you're the parent of a child with CF or some childhood illness, and you get an email from someone who says, I'm with such and such group, we are doing research on this, my child died of XYZ 2 years ago, won't you help us? Well, that's not the usual pitch that research coordinators make to possible research participants. And maybe it is something that they can't refuse. What about the so-called input-output problem, where the identity, the demographics of the people in the study have influence on the outcome of the study? So this table, I'll try to interpret for you very quickly so you won't have to burden yourself. It attempts to portray age and income in smartphone usage. So this is no surprise. People who are younger, between 18 and 25, have the most usage. The old geezers, 65 and older, don't have quite as much. And the usage goes up based on income. The gray bar is the highest income category. But interestingly, the wealthiest of the old people still is below, in terms of usage, the least wealthy of the younger people. So will mobile health research increase or decrease the diversity of the participants? You could make an argument either way. How can you verify eligibility when you don't have the people in front of you? And if you're going to try to do additional research with vulnerable subjects such as children, is that possible to do on a smartphone? What about informed consent? How valuable, feasible is the kind of consent that Sage tried to do with her Empower study? Is click-through consent adequate for online health research? Is broad or blanket consent sufficient for subsequent research uses? In the NPRM that was issued last September, it said that you can have what they called in the proposed rule, broad consent where future uses, it has to be approved now, but future uses don't require additional consent or IRB review. That's the definition, not of broad consent, but blanket consent. And they said you can have, in effect, blanket consent, even though they're only using the word broad consent. This is a study that is not published yet, that I've done with colleagues from Baylor College of Medicine, Amy McGuire and her group down there. And basically we asked a bunch of people, how comfortable are you with your health information being accessed for the following purposes? Now the first three are treatment, payment, and healthcare operations from the Hipaa privacy rule, which does not require any additional consent or authorization. But it falls off very rapidly after that. For public health, I'm sorry to tell you, only a little over half of the people are comfortable with public health usages. For research by academic researchers, only 49%, and if you go overseas, it's down to 29%. And then it goes down after that. I wonder how many of these people know that under the privacy rule, disclosures for law enforcement and national security are not subject to the rule. And I think if more people knew the 12 public purpose exceptions and the 6 exceptions that are under this category, healthcare operations, and all the other exceptions, they wouldn't be quite as confident that their health information was being protected. Further to the point on confidentiality and security, to these researchers who are not subject to regulation, do they have a duty to protect confidentiality? And the answer, of course, is no. On the other hand, maybe mobile health research will be more protected because of anonymity. What security measures are needed to protect research data? Should they have encrypted information? And are any remedies available in case of a breach? And the answer is, of course, no, but should they be? What about the results? Should they be returned? This is a whole cottage industry of studying whether you want to return results. Does an unregulated researcher have a duty to return these results? Should disclosure standards be the same? And if you decide that you want to disclose information that may be very sensitive and very, troublesome to the recipient, can you just send them an email? One of the ways that I answer this question, not so much in the context that we're talking about for mHealth and unregulated research, is to draw a clear distinction between treatment and research. I know the field may be having a convergence of these, but at least for legal purposes and regulatory purposes, they are distinct at the moment, where the purpose of treatment is for individual care, research, generalizable knowledge. External approval is not required for treatment, but it is for research. Consent is usually informal and oral for treatment, unless you're talking about something that's complex or life-threatening, like open heart surgery. For research, it's detailed, it's written, and it's presumably informed. A HIPAA-compliant authorization is not required. You get a notice of privacy practices, you're done. No more consent for you. But for research uses of PHI, protected health information, yes, it's required. Information sharing is based on professional standards in the treatment setting, but for research trial. A CLIA lab is required for treatment, but not required for research. And probably the most important, I think, is there is a fiduciary relationship between the physician and patient, where there is not a fiduciary relationship between a clinical investigator and a research subject or participant. One way of looking at it is the reason that so little is required here is because so much is required. A physician has a fiduciary obligation to act in the best interests researchers don't have that relationship, and so they have to detail exactly what they're doing and get external approval. And number 8, what about publication and data sharing? Is there a duty to disclose findings to the public or not to disclose preliminary or ambiguous findings? And what about publication? Would a traditional medical journal publish an article reporting the findings of mHealth research done by an unregulated researcher? And if they wouldn't, would other journals spring up to publish them? And is there a duty to share data with other researchers, like the NIH obligation of federally funded researchers? And if so, how? How can that be enforced? So I've got 2 final questions for you, or observations. Number 1, will non-traditional health research on smartphones establish a new paradigm for research and a new relationship between researchers and research participants? And the answer is maybe. It depends on so many things that we've talked about. And second, should traditional research ethics rules apply to non-traditional research using mobile devices, especially when used by unregulated researchers? And the answer is, well, maybe, probably in some form, but it's clear that Congress is not going to enact legislation imposing research obligations via the common rule to everyone doing research in the country. There have been proposals to do that for years and years and years, and it has very little traction. Now, many of you may have seen this cover from Science in January of 2015. You may have read it to say the end of privacy. I saw it and read it as the end of a career. The idea was that we are leaking so much information and data from our smartphones that we're not going to have much privacy left. Well, if you think, again, in the context of research, we're now possibly going to have an even greater amount of privacy. And finally, I just want to, if you're interested in more on this, I published an article last year in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, along with John Wilbanks of Sage Bionetworks and my colleague, Kyle Brothers from the University of Louisville, in which we sketched out some of these issues. So I think I've got time. So thank you, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you. Really interesting and provocative, and a lot of time for questions and comments. So we have some microphones. Emmy will find you. Raise your hand if you want to ask or say something, and maybe I'll start while I'm thinking. So among the things you alluded to and mentioned towards the end of your talk was the role of journal publishers, which reminded me of the Facebook emotional contagion study, which was then published in PNAS, to a lot of gnashing of teeth and anger about how could that be published in a way that didn't seem to follow the traditional rules of protection of human subjects. And so one answer is, if you want to do research, then it's not just the common rule and the rules that apply, but it's journal publishers that may actually have a role to play here. The other maybe fork in that road is to say, if you're an mHealth or other kind of non-traditional researcher, I just won't publish it in the traditional outlets. So sort of driving it away from the places we think of as where traditional research is actually shared, which may or may not be a good thing depending on your perspective. So maybe you can speak to that.
Well, the answer to your question is yes. I mean, I agree with your sentiments that journals are going to have to start thinking about these issues. I'm the ethics editor at the American Journal of Public Health, and I know there is 0% chance that we would publish that that's right, but that's the traditional, long-standing journal position. Now, maybe we need other journals. Maybe some of the well-established journals need a separate online publication for, you know, new discoveries by unregulated researchers or something like that. Or come up with some euphemistic term. Where those studies could be published. But I have seen no discussion yet of these kinds of issues. And I was troubled, of course, by the Facebook study, but it was an eye-opener for many people, and I think in the long run, those sorts of slaps in the face may get a response that we need to kind of work through the issues. So yes, the journal inclusion or exclusion of these articles, I think is very important.
Thank you for a really clear, provocative talk, Mark. We lawyers have to stick together.
Absolutely.
Okay, so help me through this because I'm sort of thinking out loud a little bit, but there's a real irony in what you've just gone through because not unique to this, but if you're in unregulated research, you don't have to follow rules. But the motivations are different too. So this publish or perish concern isn't a concern of people in citizen science. Their concerns are different. And so if we really want to make sure we get good data out, we have to figure out how to make it work, which I guess is your challenge to us. But at what expense? Because the thing that worries me the most isn't most of the things you laid out, except maybe the privacy one, but more about these advertisements on the smartphones to give money to these research projects, many of which have had no peer review at all. And what is the, there's a word for it, the seekers, crowdsourcing? No, that's not the, where you just, you know, any sort of thing out in the world is just a game of getting money. And this is no different. So we ask people to give money, a little bit, a lot, especially to target groups that might be vulnerable. And that worries me. And could you clarify a little bit, is there any regulation of that element, sort of before you even get started, needing the money to be able to do it? And what you would propose you might.
Well, Karen, I think you raise another sort of issue that flows from this, and that is how information that's generated by these people can be turned immediately into a marketing strategy, right? So they know, the marketers, through all sorts of devices, who's got what illnesses, and you have some, you know, iffy study that's done in a basement somewhere, and suddenly you get the, you know, the message that says, you know, if you take X, you're going to be cured. And so send off for 2 bottles of X. And I think we have to assume that is a likely scenario. Now, who's going to regulate that? I don't know whether it's the FTC, the FDA, or, you know, or what agency. But I think the combination of the marketing and the iffy, unregulated science is certainly one of the things that I'm worried about.
Now, is that any different than just currently you go to Google and you get a lot of bad information? Is it, it's like on top of that, you're now being targeted with the bad information.
Correct.
Because they have the information back.
Yeah.
So I think, Jeremy?
Thanks for that talk. I really appreciate it. A lot of questions. I'm not going to ask all of them right now.
Well, I've already said I don't know all the answers.
I'll just put two questions out. You can answer whichever way you want.
Okay.
one way of thinking about this talk is a distinction between the question of who gets to do science and how that science is done. And both of these questions actually intersect on this topic. But one of the exciting areas around studying citizen science is this moment in which this technological media and other dimensions make the process of investigation open to more people, to reduce the barriers. So one of the challenges, as you point at the end, is that any attempt to try and re-regulate or redistribute regulation raises barriers that these citizen scientists will not want to see lifted. And so how do you separate these two elements in your thinking of how the work is done versus who's doing it, and the way that changes to regulations or attempts to change regulations actually wind up modulating both of those things? Can you make the work done well without raising more barriers for those who get to do it, is I guess the question. The other question has to do with race, which is to say, I've been thinking about this problem of the inability to verify identity. And if we want to be able to study, if it's believed to be important to study using social media and technology, that's very analogous in my mind to saying that race is an important thing to be able to study, even though there's no test, right? There's no objective means of verifying someone's racial status beyond their self-identification. And yet we accept self-identification as a way of doing research about race, albeit very complicated, flawed research. Isn't this present situation of trying to study social media through self-identification analogous in both respects? But you can answer again, either one.
Yes, now I've got to decide which one so let me just say briefly about the second one and more about the first one. I think there are ways that you can get to self-identification, verification through kind of technical means. The computer people are talking to me and I'm listening and not understanding all the time. But I think we can do that. What the problem is you have a hard time screening out people who shouldn't be in the study. You can verify that they are who they say they are, but you don't necessarily know whether they meet all the inclusion criteria. I think that's the problem. So on the first one, tell me again what that was. That was the one I liked.
Who versus us?
Oh yes, who versus us. I think as a strategy, one of the things that I think we ought to do as, I'll include you for sure, as people who want to see research done ethically and with maximum protection for the welfare of the participants, I think we can't sit back. I think we have to go out and find these people. And one of the things that I've proposed is that we ought to have open source ethics consultation and teaching modules for health app designers and these other people, because many of the people have very few credentials in the sciences and they're just sort of piecing things together. And if you could convince them that it is not going to cost you anything, it's not going to inhibit a lot of what you're trying to do, that we have off-the-shelf remedies that will make your product better, more accepted, et cetera, they might be willing to integrate them into what they're doing. And so that's one of the things that I'm working on now. Not sitting back and waiting for them to have this epiphany that we need to comply with ethics, to find these people, to organize them, and to try to reach them somehow.
Mark, thanks for a great talk. And I want to build on Karen's saying that she wants to be provocative, so I'm going to try to be a little provocative too. I note that this was framed in terms of all of the hazards. And what I didn't hear, and I get it, it's not the point, is what potentially could similarly with public health, we don't give them the choice about whether we're going to keep track of the number of whatever it is outbreaks. So I just, I sort of want to put out these contextual things to, maybe think about how do we get to best practices, and are there ways to frame this that are a little more holistic than we've got the common rule, shouldn't this be part of the common rule too? Because I totally get it with what the risks could be.
Well, Nancy, thank you for making my job totally impossible.
Invite you back.
Yeah, so, I mean, I agree with you. I think from a more philosophical standpoint, what you're raising is the conflict between autonomy and paternalism, right? Should we allow people to be able to do what they want on both sides, to do the science that they want and to avail themselves of whatever they want? Or are we in the business of saying certain things are so important, so dangerous, have such a historical record of screw-ups that we are going to impose certain rules? And if the latter, under what circumstances now are we going to apply it to this online new wrinkle? And I just don't know. I think it's a very difficult question. I'm less concerned about the marketing that flows from your prior purchases. Everyone who buys groceries at a store where there's a discount if you use them before, or even pays with a credit card, you're announcing to the world that this is what you've purchased. I'm less worried about that than I am the kind of the health-related marketing schemes and the health-related loss of privacy, especially for people who have sensitive or stigmatizing conditions. But it's a question that we're going to have to think about. I mean, what I presented today is what I think is an interesting little portion of a very big problem. And when I feel like I've got my answer for my little problem, then maybe we can talk about the big one.
Hi, thanks, Mark. I just wanted to piggyback a little. I wonder if part of it, so yes, I think it's a big task, but I wonder if part of it also is the lack of transparency might not be the right word, but the lack of understanding by the average person that the two things that Nancy was sort of putting together, that are not the same, right? So I guess to say something like, I might not be worried that I'm getting a clog advertisement because I know that, that's just how the system works. But I may not know that signing up for that diabetes app is pushing information to the proprietary, algorithm and pushing back information to me that is completely unregulated. And I wonder if part of it is if the average person knew that there's a difference, and on your list, right, that 15% of them think it's okay for the information to go to a commercial entity, but 100% of it is going to them.
Right.
That I guess to say it might be useful in some way to conflate, may not be the right word, for the general public's consumption that may make some progress in the space that you're specifically talking about in terms of the more sensitive information that people could be harmed by, or, right, that either the disclosure be harmed or I'm going to be marketed some quack remedy for my disease.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one other thing that I need to mention, of course, is even if we are successful, whatever that means, in dealing with the problem here in the U.S.,
Yeah.
what are we going to do to the people who are running, I don't want to say scams, but who are doing research and marketing abroad, where we have no control over them, and they have direct So thank you for raising that. It'll give me an opportunity to clarify something that I may not have explained very well. That slide with the green and the yellow, the research versus treatment, that was an attempt to answer the question of should there be return of results. And using that slide suggests to me that return of results should be not viewed through the lens of what would a treating physician return, but what would a researcher return. And I think the obligations are quite different. And I have suggested that I thought, well, I'll say that I think many people have advocated much more widespread return of results of research than I would be comfortable with. And the way I try to build my case is say, this is not treatment, this is research. The obligations of researchers are quite distinct. And that was not suggested as a tool or a lens through which to view all of the different categories that I outlined. So thank you for the excellent questions, and I enjoyed interacting